All right, let me ask you something simple. What do you think is happening right now? Because if your answer is inflation is a little high, or there's some tension between the US and China, or the supply chain thing is still recovering from COVID, I need you to stop right now, close that mental file, because what you just described is the decor, the wallpaper. You're describing the paint job on a building that is structurally condemned. The global economy has not shifted. It has not adjusted. It has not entered a new cycle the way the textbooks describe cycles. Those words shift, adjust, cycle. Those are the words of people who believe the old system is still running in the background, waiting to be restored. It isn't. What we are living through right now is a civilizational regime change in how wealth is created, stored, controlled, and weaponized. Most people don't see it yet. And the reason they don't see it isn't because they're stupid. It's because nobody in a position of institutional authority has any incentive to tell them. The people who are supposed to translate the world for you, the anchors, the analysts, the central bank spokespeople, they are, every single one of them, creatures of the old system. They are trying to explain a new war using the grammar of an old piece. So here's the ultimatum. You can either sit back and keep waiting for things to normalize, in which case you will be completely blindsided by what is already unfolding, or you can sit down, take this seriously, and understand what has actually happened. Wake up or get left behind. Those are genuinely your only two options. Now, to understand where we are, you have to understand where we were and why that world exists in the first place. After 1945, the United States built something extraordinary. Not just a military empire, not just an economic empire, an architectural empire. They designed the actual operating system of global commerce. Bretton Woods, the dollar as the reserve currency, the IMF, the World Bank, GATT, which became the WTO. This entire infrastructure was specifically constructed so that every country on earth that wanted to participate in international trade had to do so through a framework that Washington largely controlled. Think about what that actually means in practice. If you're a country in Southeast Asia or West Africa or South America and you want to buy oil, because everyone needs oil, you need dollars to buy it, which means you need to earn dollars, which means you need to trade with the dollar system, which means functionally you are inside the American financial architecture, whether you chose to be or not. That is not free trade. That is a gravity well. And for roughly 70 years, most of the world lived inside that gravity well and called it prosperity. For a lot of people, it genuinely was. Cheap goods flooded out of manufacturing hubs. Capital moved with relatively low friction. A middle class expanded slowly and unevenly across the developing world. Okay? But here's the thing about architectures that concentrate power. They create resentment, slowly, persistently, and with compounding interest. Russia watched NATO expand eastward through the 1990s and 2000 and drew a red line that everyone in Washington pretended wasn't there. China watched its own industries get hollowed out by the conditions attached to WTO membership and made a quiet generational decision: we will build parallel infrastructure. The global south watched the dollar get weaponized through sanctions, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, Sudan, and began asking a question that would have been unthinkable 20 years ago: what if we didn't need the dollar? These were not random events. This was the old architecture generating its own opposition. And by 2022, when Russia's foreign exchange reserves, $450 billion, were simply frozen by the West, that question stopped being theoretical. Every non-Western finance minister on earth had the same thought simultaneously: that could be us. That was the moment. That was the hinge point, not COVID, not the 2008 crisis. February 2022 was when the old world formally ended and the new one began, with almost nobody in Western media willing to say it plainly. So what exactly has changed? Let me give it to you systematically. First, the weaponization of the dollar has accelerated its own replacement. All right, this sounds paradoxical, so stay with me. The dollar's power as a reserve currency rested on trust. Not trust in American virtue, nobody was naive about that, but trust in American predictability. The implicit deal was, even if we disagree with you, we know your system runs on rules, and those rules apply even to your enemies. The moment you freeze Russia's reserves, you have broken that deal. You have told every country on earth that dollar assets can be confiscated by political decision. That is not a recoverable PR problem. That is a fundamental reclassification of what a dollar is. And the response has been what you'd expect. The BRICS bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, now expanded with Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, Ethiopia, Egypt, and Argentina has been accelerating bilateral trade in non-dollar currencies. China and Saudi Arabia are now settling oil trades in renminbi. Russia and India are trading in rupees and rubles. This is not a revolution, it is an erosion. But erosion, given enough time and pressure, produces canyons. Second, the era of cheap globalization is permanently over. The model that powered global growth for 30 years was this: manufacture in the cheapest place, move goods with minimal friction across open seas, sell in the richest market. That model required peace, predictability, and integrated supply chains. You now have none of those three things at adequate scale. China and the United States are in a full spectrum strategic competition. That is not a trade dispute. A trade dispute is about tariffs on soybeans. What we have is a systematic decoupling of the two largest economies on Earth across semiconductors, rare earth minerals, AI development, pharmaceutical supply chains, and military technology. That decoupling is irreversible in any politically relevant time frame. The world is not going to undecouple. It is going to finish decoupling. And the cost of that process, the friendshoring, the reshoring, the redundant supply chains, gets passed somewhere. It gets passed to you in prices. Third, energy geopolitics have been permanently restructured. The assumption that hydrocarbon markets were globally integrated and politically neutral, that was always a fiction, but it was a useful fiction. Now it is openly a fiction. Russia has redirected its energy exports to Asia. The Gulf states are diversifying their strategic relationships. Europe is paying 2 to 3 times more for energy than its industrial competitors in Asia and North America, which is a slow motion deindustrialization sentence. And here is where the if-then chain becomes brutal. If European manufacturing becomes structurally uncompetitive due to energy costs, and it is already happening, look at BASF relocating capacity to Louisiana. Look at the German automotive sector, then European unemployment rises, political extremism rises with it. And the transatlantic alliance that has been the anchor of the Western system since 1945 comes under pressures it was not designed to handle. This is not doom-mongering. This is reading a sequence. Fourth, and this is the one that almost nobody is talking about clearly, the global debt structure is entering a terminal phase of its logic. 40 years of falling interest rates allowed governments, corporations, and households across the developed world to carry debt loads that were only serviceable in a zero-rate environment. Rates are no longer zero. They are not going back to zero without triggering the kind of inflation that ends governments. So we have a world full of debt structures that were built for a world that no longer exists, held together by the assumption that central banks will find a way to make it work. That is not an investment thesis. That is a prayer. Now, here's what I want you to sit with for a moment. Everything I have just described, the dollar erosion, the supply chain fragmentation, the energy restructuring, the debt trap, none of it is a surprise. None of it is unprecedented. Every single dynamic I've walked you through has historical precedents that economists and geopolitical historians have been documenting and warning about for years, decades in some cases. The terrifying part isn't that it's happening. The terrifying part is that the official narrative, the one being sold to you by elected officials, by financial media, by institutional economists, is still operating as if the old world is recoverable with the right policy mix. As if we just need the right rate decision, the right trade negotiation, the right diplomatic summit, and we can put this back in the bottle. We cannot put this back in the bottle. The bottle has been redesigned. What keeps me up at night, and I say this as someone who has spent years studying systemic transitions, is not the macro collapse of the old architecture, systems transition. That's survivable for civilizations, even when it is catastrophic for specific generations of people who live through the transition. What keeps me up at night is the mismatch, the staggering, almost unfathomable mismatch between the scale of what is changing and the cognitive frameworks most people are using to process it. When the Roman trade network collapsed in the 5th century, the people living through it mostly didn't know they were living through it. They thought it was a bad few years. They thought the next emperor would fix it. The idea that the entire operating system of Mediterranean civilization was being replaced. That didn't occur to most of them until they were already living in the rubble. We have better information than they did. We have no excuse. So what do you actually do with this? Let me be precise, because I am not interested in vague reassurances. First, you update your mental model. You stop treating the current disruptions as temporary deviations from a stable baseline and start treating them as the new baseline itself. That single cognitive shift from this is abnormal to this is the new normal and it's still getting more extreme changes every decision you make, from how you hold savings to how you think about which industries have futures. Second, you understand that there will be winners in this transition. Transitions always create winners. The collapse of British imperial hegemony in the 20th century was a catastrophe for Britain and a generational opportunity for the United States. The collapse of the American-designed Bretton Woods architecture will be catastrophic for the institutions and nations most dependent on it, and an extraordinary structural opportunity for those positioned correctly. The commodities that underpin the new energy order, lithium, cobalt, rare earths, copper, are not evenly distributed. The countries that have them are rewriting their own geopolitical relevance in real time. The technologies that allow states to operate outside Western financial architecture, digital currencies, alternative payment rails, bilateral settlement mechanisms, these are not science fiction. They exist. They are scaling. Third, and this is a foundational point, you accept that the rules of the next 40 years will be written in the next decade. The window to position yourself, your thinking, your understanding inside the new paradigm is not infinite. It is happening now, whether you are paying attention or not. The world has already changed. That part is not a prediction. It is a description of what has occurred. All right? Here's where this goes. We have only scratched the surface today. What I've given you is the architecture, the structural skeleton of what has shifted. But the skeleton only makes sense when you understand the muscle and sinew wrapped around it. What does the BRICS expansion actually mean for dollar trade flows in real numbers? What is China's actual timeline for Taiwan? And how does that interact with the semiconductor decoupling we've been discussing? What happens to sovereign debt markets when the next major economy, and I have a specific candidate in mind, enters a debt spiral it cannot inflate its way out of? These are not rhetorical questions. These are the next chapters. And I intend to take you through every one of them methodically, because this is too important to reduce to talking points and hot takes. In the next installment, we are going to go deep on one specific mechanism that almost nobody in mainstream financial media is covering, how the restructuring of energy payment systems is quite building a parallel reserve currency architecture, and what that means for every dollar-denominated asset on the planet. If you thought today was uncomfortable, wait until you see the specifics. That is coming. Stay ahead of it.